Iron Eagle came out in 86. So did Top Gun. They'll both hit 35.
Wow.
And sorry, Ben, but you had the worst movie.
Welcome, everyone, to the Scuttlebutt. I'm your host, Sean Hall, the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club, a small nonprofit based in Pittsburgh, PA. Our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. Our program, the Scuttlebutt, was created to highlight the educational elements of our mission by discussing recent military headlines and topics to help bridge the civilian-military divide. I'm so excited to have you all join us again. Also, if you'd be so kind, we ask that you please help spread the Scuttlebutt by liking, sharing, subscribing, and ringing the bell on YouTube so you are the first to know whenever we post our videos on Monday. We also want to connect with you, so please leave us a comment on YouTube or email me at sean@veteransbreakfastclub.com. We'd love to hear from you. We always love opening mail at the Scuttlebutt, so definitely click on us to connect. Today, we have two newbies, or to say like our video game episode, noobs. Is that the correct term, James?
It is.
Noobs is newbies. So we got a couple noobs, which is not a bad thing to be. It's somebody new to something. But I'm going to hand off to Becky. I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Thank you for joining us on the Scuttlebutt.
Hi, thanks for having me, Sean. My name's Becky Nyren. I am a Gold Star wife. My husband, Nathaniel, was in the Army serving in Baghdad, Iraq, when he was killed in 2004, December 28th. And I've been involved with the Veterans Breakfast Club for probably going on 3 years. My friend Ann introduced me to Todd at an event at Soldiers and Sailors a few years ago. And I just thought it was something that I was interested in getting involved with. And I wanted to join this conversation today just to see what the Scuttlebutt is about and hopefully become more involved in the future.
That's awesome. And I can completely relate to that, Becky, and this idea of like, we're both not veterans, trying to get more involved and understanding more of the military culture. And I have a question for you just right off the bat before I get to Ben and his introduction. Is being a Gold Star wife and being a non-veteran, do you find that you have more interest in the military culture and attending like VBC events and hearing veteran stories? That sort of is an interest that you have?
It definitely is. And that's one of my hopes in becoming involved in the VBC, is to maybe spread the word to younger veterans. I just like to try to do my part to get the word out by sharing things on social media and learning as much as I can.
That's great. And, you know, it's interesting. Yeah, we don't have a large military presence in Western PA, but we have a large veteran presence.
Exactly.
It's one of the top three, I think, in the country in this particular area. And one of those veterans is Ben Wright. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Well, you're welcome, Sean. Thank you for inviting me. And of course, the reason Sean invited me is because of focus on Air Force. And I was active duty Air Force for 22 years, from 1969 to 1991. So from towards the end of Vietnam and through Desert Storm, and then I retired from the Air Force. I wound up in Western Pennsylvania because I came here after I retired and went to seminary at Trinity School for Ministry. And first met Todd. I was actually doing supply work at a church in the South Hills. And he came to speak at a veterans honoring event the church was hosting, and met him. And so I started coming to BBC events, and I've been going to those now for, almost 10 years. And then I've been on the board for the Veterans Breakfast Club for 5 years, and I'll be on it for another year. So I really like what the Veterans Breakfast Club does, giving people a safe place to tell their stories and preserving them. My personal interest is in the healing aspect, because we do have people that have never told their stories, and it's really very helpful to them to share and find a place where they feel comfortable with sharing their stories.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Ben, and thank you for joining us for our, you gave away the goose. We have the special first part of our 6-part series today, focusing on the Air Force. So Ben, we're gonna chat with you a lot as we get into our main story concerning the Air Force. And also, I'll use an Air Force term. My wingman, James Martin, joining us, though he is a Marine veteran. James, it's always good to see you. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course. Well, great. Let's dive straight into our episode today. We are going to start with our phrase of the day, which I actually pulled two because it seems like the Air Force has a lot of different military terms that I had no idea about, or when I read them, I get very confused. But the first one was pull chocks, and we were talking before we started recording, Ben, that pull chocks. What does that actually mean?
Actually, all military vehicles in the Air Force had to carry chocks with them if they were going anywhere near the flight line.
Mm-hmm.
So they were either in the trunk or the back end of the pickup or truck or van or whatever kind of vehicle it was, because you couldn't go near an aircraft or anything on the flight line that once you parked it and stopped it, you had to put chocks under the wheels because you didn't want it rolling. That included not only vehicles, but ground equipment. So we would have fire carts and air carts and, all these maintenance equipment things on the flight line. And anytime they weren't actually being moved, they had to have chock. And especially in backing vehicles, you always had to have somebody to monitor you, to back you in to the aircraft, and always had the chocks there with it.
Whenever you got to get the chocks removed, when you're pulling the chocks, you would radio out to have them pull them, or would you just yell out the window?
No, we worked with the ground crews. The noise level's pretty high on flight lines, and we just get 2 thumbs. Let me get it back to where you can see it, and we just tell them to pull the chocks.
Our second term, I'll move on to it, is called the snake pit. Now, this is the definition of the snake pit. It's where Air Force MTIs eat, usually right at the end of the chow line. So every airman trainee has to walk by to get to their table. I'm assuming you would walk by this area and catch a lot of flack from the MTIs. What are MTIs for one, Ben? And did you ever experience the snake pit?
Well, MTIs were military training instructors. They
Like
were
drill
distinctively
instructors.
known in the Air Force because they were Smokey the Bear hats. I think some of the other military services used the Smokey the Bear hats too. The term snake pit probably came in to being after I was in basic training. I went through basic training and then was in officer trainee hold before I went to officers training school. But we did have very strict rules in the chow hall, and we had to eat very quickly. They didn't give us much time. You had to be very quiet. Interesting enough, of course, I went through basic training at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, which is very hot and humid, especially in June and July. When I went through basic training, I was what was known as a chow runner, which meant I had an extra canteen with salt tablets in it. And I had to run up there first and tell the chow hall how many people were in the flight that were going to eat. And then I had salt tablets. And everybody had to take salt tablets as they went in and take them because they didn't want people to hydrate. They wanted them to continue to retain plenty of water. But otherwise, while you're waiting in line, you were looking at the back of the head of the guy in front of you. You didn't say anything. And you got your food and you went and you sat down and you couldn't talk and you gobbled it down and you were out to go to class with a drill pad or wherever you were going from there.
James, yeah, did you ever experience the snake pit? Or was there a similar one in the Marines?
If the snake pit was the lineup of the drill instructors, because they drill instructors for the Marine Corps had the Smokey the Bear hats. You didn't want to cross in front of them. You wanted to be as quiet as a mouse. But it's interesting. So Ben had the role of the last child recruit. So he was the last person up. He was the person that we hated because if he ate real fast, if he ate faster than everybody else the minute he was done, everybody leaves.
Oh, So
he
you want
was
him to slowly
you're
eat.
like, please look, just take your time. Please don't eat too fast. Man.
Did you ever get less food because you were the last person in line? Was there ever like, oh, they ran out of the hash browns, I'm really mad now?
Yeah, what it really boiled down to is when the TI, the training instructor, was through eating, he said, "Come on, let's go." And because I was always last in line, I usually wasn't done yet when we left.
All right, moving into our headline segment for military headlines this week. We got a couple here, very interesting stuff. First, there was a 12,000-pound British tall boy World War II era bomb exploded in a shipping canal off the Polish port city of Świnoujście as a team of Navy divers were working to neutralize it remotely. No one was hurt in this explosion. We'll put up a video of this, but it was the second largest bomb used by British forces during the war after the 22,000-pound Grand Slam munition. Together, the tall boy and the Grand Slam were known as earthquake bombs for the devastation they caused on land. And Poland has been clearing explosive remnants of war from its territory since the end of World War II, according to experts with the International Committee of the Red Cross. From 1944 to 2003, more than 96 million pieces of explosive ordnance had been removed at an estimated cost of $866 million, the experts wrote. And from 1944 to 1989, unexploded ordnance claimed the lives of more than 4,000 people in Poland. I thought those numbers were very high, but given the expanse of World War II, the fact that 96 million pieces of explosive ordnance were removed, that's astronomical, in my opinion. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there was a lot of unexploded ordnance. I was stationed in Germany for 4 years. I was there from 87 to 91. And our EOD people were going out and construction crews would be digging holes in the ground or making something. And every time we turn around, they'd find some more unexploded ordnance, and they had to go out and deal with them to render them safe. And they're still doing it today. In fact, when we went to Vietnam on one of the BBC trip in 2018, we'll go back to Vietnam, and they're still finding lots of unexploded ordnance.
Moving on to our next headline, the USS Stout recently made port, but what made this a headline is that it had spent 215 days at sea. It went from March to October without setting foot on land and performed maintenance usually done in port. They did that all at sea. What's interesting is that the crew of the Arleigh Burke class destroyer was finally brought off, but this was all in the face of COVID. Obviously, that's why they stayed out to sea so long. 215 days. James, what is your longest time at sea being a Marine?
I think I was in the sea for like a month, a little over a month. We left in
31 days.
Yeah, a little over that. I was about to say, I know we left in January, got there by middle February. Because I remember my birthday, the year that I went on the float was the first time in my life where it was 90 degrees in February on my birthday. It was the hottest I'd ever been for my birthday. I'm always from Pennsylvania. It's always cold. And it was 90 degrees and I could see pyramids. So it took us a little over a month, but that's a long time to be in a bubble.
Yeah. Becky, have you ever been on a ship for even 30 days?
I can't even imagine. I went on a 7-day cruise through Alaska, but we deboarded at least 4 times during that 7 days. So I can't imagine being, and we could see land the majority of the time because we were in the inland passage, and I can't imagine that now.
I was the same way. Took a cruise down through the Caribbean, and got off the boat 4 times over the course of a week. But 215 days, you definitely have to hand it to those sailors. That's a long time at sea. Moving on to our next headline, retired Air Force Colonel Gail S. Halvorsen also known as the Candy Bomber, changed the course of history with just 2 pieces of gum. He turned 100 years old this month. Why was he called the Candy Bomber? Well, during the Berlin airlift, he would drop chocolate with little parachutes to the children at Tempelhof Airfield in what was dubbed Operation Little Vittles. It's a really exciting story that he was talking with some of the children there. He handed them 2 pieces of gum. They broke it up so that they could share it amongst their friends. He felt really inspired by this. He started dropping candy for them. He became known as the Candy Bomber. But as he turns 100, he shared a couple of things he has learned along the way. 1, children hold the future of the entire world in their hands. Our children and everyone's children. 2, give service to others if you seek genuine fulfillment. The Dead Sea is dead because it does not give. And 3, if there is conflict when you make a decision, put principle before pleasure. The Berlin kids did. Freedom, sometimes in the dim future, was more important to them than the pleasure of enough food. Ben, had you heard of Gale? And did you know of sort of his exploits during the Berlin airlift?
Yeah, I was very familiar with it, in Air Force history. In fact, if you go to the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base near Dayton, Ohio, they have a display that even talks about that. And Tempelhof's a very interesting place to fly into. There's one of these things in the Air Force, that you would compute to be able to take off distance and clear a 50-foot obstacle at the end of the runway, but it was mythical. At Tempelhof, it's not mythical. And you would come in final approach to Tempelhof. There was so much encroachment of buildings. I mean, you could look out the windows on either side and see people in their apartments. But there are still Messerschmitts underwater on the assembly line at Tempelhof that were underground factories. And the Russians flooded it all out, and those Messerschmitts are still sitting there on the assembly line underwater.
What is a Messerschmitt, you said?
Yeah, that was a German aircraft.
Ah, okay.
Fighter aircraft.
We'll put up a picture of that. I think that would be interesting to show our audience. Yeah, the Candy Bomber, he was famous and recently turning 100. We will tip our cap to him. And our final bit of headline here. This is an update on what we've been reporting on with the Marines and their gender integration into training, is that in our own backyard where we record the Scuttlebutt here in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh is now getting involved. The Marines have awarded a $2 million contract to the University of Pittsburgh to conduct a study on how to best gender integrate the Marine Corps boot camp at the platoon level, according to a Marine Corps press release. The funding will go to the university's Neuromuscular Research Laboratory and Warrior Human Performance Research Center, and is meant to analyze combinations of gender-integrated training and make recommendations for models that integrate genders to the greatest extent possible while continuing to train Marines to established standards, the press release said. Training in Parris Island, South Carolina, and San Diego will be studied, along with data collected from entry-level training conducted by the other services, being Army, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard. The study is going to take 18 months and include interviews, focus group surveys, physical performance data, salivary biomarkers, and injury surveillance. This is a great opportunity for University of Pittsburgh to sort of stretch its muscle. James, I'd love to go to you to hear your thoughts as they continue to work towards gender integration.
I'm all for it. I see that they're actually going behind the science behind it. They're not just hodgepodging and saying, "Hey, everybody's together." That they're trying to figure out the best way to make it as sustainable as possible. So I see no problem with that, and I like seeing outside entities come in and be, "Hey, we're not the experts. We just want to do a thing," and getting the best minds to make this happen. I'm all in.
Totally. And Becky, I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts as the Marines begin to do this. They were put on a 5-year plan. They're trying to do this, like James said, the best way possible. What are your thoughts as they start to gender integrate their training?
Well, first of all, I think it's a great opportunity for the University of Pittsburgh. And I know it's also a great opportunity for women in the military in general, not only Marines. It's been only recently that women have become involved in more combat related roles in the military. And I think it's just a great opportunity for women all throughout the military to have more of those combat related roles available to them.
Well, that does it for our headlines. We'd love to jump right into our main story this week, which what we mentioned earlier was starting a six-part series here, focusing on each individual branch. First up, maybe because it's alphabetical, is the Air Force. So Ben being our resident Air Force veteran, we might just pepper Ben with some questions. But I want to take a look first at the Air Force core values. And it says integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do are a commitment each airman makes when joining the Air Force. Ben, you joined the Air Force. Was there a reason that you chose that branch over the others? And did the core values speak to you as you entered?
Well, I was interested in flying, and of course, I had a little different motivation because the draft was still going on during Vietnam. And of course, there were already veterans coming back from Vietnam when they were on active duty. And these guys coming back to college had been on search and destroy teams and those sorts of things in Vietnam. And I said, well, if I got to do this, I think I'd rather fly airplanes, because at the time they were drafting about a third of the people being drafted were going to the Marines, and about 2/3 in the Army, and 98% of them were going to the infantry. So they would complete their basic training and maybe a little bit more training and straight to Vietnam. And I said, I'm happy to take on the additional commitment. I think I'll go fly airplanes. So I volunteered to go to pilot training. I didn't have my acceptance for pilot training officer training school, so I was in graduate school, at graduate assistantship. So I did a delayed enlistment in March of '69, so I could finish the semester of school I was in, and went to basic training in June. In my first week in basic training, then I got my acceptance to go to pilot training. Mm-hmm. And so I started pilot training actually in January of 70. But I looked at the Navy. I was newly married at the time that I went in. I wasn't interested in being gone in sea, even if I'd elected to go naval aviation. And I wasn't interested in the Army or the Coast Guard or the Marines. And so I said, the Air Force is the right answer for me. Of course, I had a history of people in the family of the Air Force. I have two brothers in my family who were both served in the Air Force. Only concurrently served with one of them. And then my father actually had two families, and out of his first family, which were all World War II veterans, 2 or 3 of them were also in the Army Air Corps. So there was a history of doing that.
You spoke to something there that I find a bit confusing, being a civilian, is you said naval air aviation. When I see planes, I always think Air Force, but what is the difference between the Navy fighter jets and the Air Force fighter jets? Why, are there different planes? Is there a different training regiment? Why does the Navy have planes and the Air Force isn't flying them? It's sort of something that I've always been, a little bit not sure what to think.
Well, the Navy's, most aircraft do operate off of carriers. And so most are fighter aircraft, ground attack aircraft, some air superiority, but also intelligence gathering, air command and control. Some were the Air Force, and the Marines would operate. In fact, when I went through pilot training, Pendleton or the Navy pilot training couldn't take all the Marine slots. So we actually had 2 Marines in most of our training flights in the Air Force. So there were 2 Marines in my class in pilot training. In fact, the first person that wound up getting killed in a plane crash out of my pilot training class was a Marine, because we graduated and 3 weeks later he was checking out at A4s at Cherry Point, North Carolina, and crashed on short climate when he was down there to carrier qualifying the A4. So there were a lot of similarities. You know, they both fly. Operating off aircraft carriers is another world. There's a whole lot that goes with that. You know, we always had to be careful, especially when I was flying T-37s as an instructor. We had to always land past the arresting gear because our gear doors were too low and they'd get hung up on the arresting gear and you get in all kinds of trouble.
So one of the main differences I'd say between the Air Force and the Navy, Navy Air is the Navy, they're mostly taking off and landing from aircraft carriers. Air Force has more Air Force has more air superiority. They're not necessarily looking to survey or protect a fleet. Air Force is mostly concerned about air superiority. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, air superiority and the whole airlift component and the strategic bombing component and air refueling. Now, the Navy has and Marines have some air refueling, but most of the air refueling is with the Air Force as well. The other big difference is the Marine aviation, because they're primarily ground attack, they are controlled by the ground commander in the Marines, where the Air Force has always been insistent of we're a separate service and we have command and control of our own forces. And so there's differences in the command and control of the missions as well, and a completely different air philosophy.
Does the Army Air Corps still exist?
Well, 1947, that National Defense Act, the Army Air Corps became the Air Force, just like recently the Space Force used to be Space Command and the Air Force, now Space Force, only it's not completely separate like the Air Force is. It's a similar arrangement what the Marines are with the Navy. The Marines are somewhat under the umbrella of the Navy, and so is the Space Force under the umbrella of the Air Force. But it's been a separate branch since 1947. In fact, when I went base training, they were still talking about the brown shoe days, which was right after World War II, when you know everything changed when they changed from Army to Air Force.
That brings me to my next question: is how did you, having such a long history in the Air Force, how did it change over the course of your tenure, and how have you seen it change even after you retired?
Well, you know, there was a lot more concern about quality of life later than there was during Vietnam. And of course, it was all the draft pressure in Vietnam. And then in '72, when people were no longer drafted. And so the whole world changed when the military became an all-volunteer force. And that was a lot of the emphasis, was to understand that if we want to keep people and stay for a career, which is the goal, because it costs so much money to recruit and train people, especially when you start talking about things like flying aircraft and getting combat qualified in different weapon systems. And so it was the understanding that you have to take good care of people if you want to keep them, and not only them, but their families. So the quality of life has to be better if you want to retain people. They've been concerned about a pilot training shortage lately. It's been a lot of alleviated because people aren't getting out of the Navy or the Marines or the Air Force to go to the airlines, because the airlines aren't hiring them. But once the airlines get back up and running with this COVID thing, they'll be back hiring pilots. So the Air Force is still working ways to increase the number of pilots and ways to keep them on board, because these multiple deployments, you know, there've been a lot of people 10, 12 years in, and they wind up going to Afghanistan 3, 4, 5, 6 times and leaving their families. And they say, I just can't do this to my family anymore. I'm getting out.
James, did you at points during your deployment have to interact with the Air Force to call in, you know, if you had to call in airstrikes, and how did that interplay work?
Absolutely. So with artillery, we had our forward observers, and a lot of our forward observers, we actually had to train and send them off to an additional level of training because they had to work with the ATCs. The ATCs would be the air traffic controls, the guys who would call in strikes or whatever, or any sort of air that was on station. So if we had problems like troops in contact, or there was a specific target that we couldn't hit, and maybe we needed the AC-130, we could train our forward observers to be able to make that call. They would understand how to work the equipment to get the feed in, so we could watch and see what was going on. And so the correlation between the two really had to work out well. We had to understand what each other was talking about. My first deployment, we had no idea what was going on. So, our FDC and things like that would have contact with somebody higher who would reach up higher than us to get air on station and things like that. But by my third deployment, we got a lot more proficient with it because um, air assets were a rare commodity. You better have good reason to have that, you know, that joint strike fighter come in out of nowhere and pluck a target for whatever reason. So we had to be very proficient, understand the rules of engagement, the range of, some of the things that were even that were in theater. So if it was a helo that might have been a marine helo, that's one thing. But if we were calling a Raptor, we'd had to understand its capabilities, what it was doing, what it was capable of doing, before we just made a call and wasted that person's time.
And how did you find the interplay with the Air Force being a Marine?
Uh, we're all in it for the same purpose. It's just, you know, we'll crack our jokes. They're sitting somewhere comfortable and got air conditioning. We're sitting down here in the dirt. Will you please come help us? But outside of that, it was never too much of a problem. There was all appreciation. We joke whenever it's not time to go to work, but when the artillery pieces come out and you see those birds behind Ben there start rolling down the field, jokes are over. It's time to go to work.
Right.
So it worked out really well. Like, we come into Afghanistan, we're taking Air Force planes. Air Force, sometimes Navy, whatever it is. But hey, look, we weren't walking here. Thank you for the ride. Thank you for getting us to where we need to get to. If so, we always appreciate when it's time to go to
Oh, yeah.
work.
I airlifted a lot of Army and Marines and even so Coast Guard. But in recent years, the Air Force has more and more forward air controllers on the ground, particularly with the Army and their special ops people, and they're actually out in the field with the Army. I don't know how much they're doing that with the Marines, probably some, so they have the coordination. In fact, the Air Force has extended the length of time in basic training, where they actually, basic trainees in the Air Force now have put 3 weeks of basically infantry training and how to be ground troops because of air-based defense and because so many people are getting involved directly with ground troops. They had to be trained to be able to work in that environment.
And James, you brought up a good point that there's a lot of good joking between the branches. I'm sure we'll talk about that over this 6-part series. But Ben, we all heard the jokes about the chair force, things like that. And I think it's a good point now to be able to sort of debunk that and say, like, do you think the Air Force gets a bad rap for either pilot egos or for having it a little too easy and basic, or being in the room with the AC? There's obviously some highly technical and very difficult things the Air Force has to accomplish, but they also seem to get ribbed a bit for.
Yeah, I from my experience-based training, officer training school, I didn't think it was easy, either academically or the physical training. So I would submit that the physical training in basic training and officer training school is every bit as strenuous in the Air Force as it is in the Army and Marine. Well, maybe not as the Marines, because they did give you a little bit more sleep, but not much. but there was emphasis on physical training. You had to go annual tests. You know, you had to go run a mile and a half or whatever. They keep changing, you know, what they're using, but you had to go prove you were physically fit every year. And of course, they were always checking your weight and those kinds of things. So there was always, you got to be well and strong and healthy and able to endure whatever. And when I was at Bitburg in Germany, Desert Storm, we deployed basically the wing, half of it to Saudi Arabia and half to Turkey. And the ones that went to Saudi Arabia, they were living in tents, you know, for months. So the Air Force does that too. It's whatever the mission demands, you do it, and that's with any branch of the service.
Becky, I'd like to pop to you real quick. Having heard a lot of veteran stories over the years, is there something in particular that sort of impresses you about the Air Force above the other branches? I
have a good friend who's a 30-year retired chief from the Air Force, and he was always pretty tight-lipped about what he did. And my impression with the different branches was kind of like the brain versus the brawn, maybe, for lack of a better term. And I will hear just different, knowing people from all the branches of the military, there's always that jab that goes along with, we're better than you are, or we're smarter than you are, or we do this, that, or the other things. So no, it is interesting to hear the different thoughts on the different branches of what their role is in the military.
Mm-hmm. What type of planes did you fly, Ben?
The one in the virtual background behind me, which is the C-130. This one's a T-37, which is a side-by-side trainer, is made to spin and do stalls and falls, and was the primary jet trainer for many years. It's now been replaced by the AT-6 Texan II. And then when I went back to Air Training Command, I flew this aircraft, the T-38, which is a tandem seat. And so most of the time you flew in the back seat, which is challenging to do backseat landings, especially. It was known as the sports car of the Air Force. I mean, this thing moved.
That's the one I want to fly in. That's the one. Yeah. That's the one, Ben. You got to take me up in.
Okay.
Pull some strings.
They still use them.
Pull some strings. Let's get. Yeah. I'm free this afternoon.
It was the same airframe as the F-5 fighter, which were extensively used in Vietnam and other places, and foreign sales to foreign air forces. My operational experience was all in tactical airlift. So I flew 130s. We did short field operations, airdrops, container delivery system, heavy equipment, personnel. So we worked a lot with the Army in particular, doing airdrops and joint airborne air transportability training with them. I did have 2 tours in Air Training Command training pilots, one in T-37s and one in T-38s. The notable thing when I went back to the second tour was my first tour, there were no women in pilot training. My second tour, we had women in pilot training. And women make very good pilots. In fact, you've flown with women pilots on commercial flights if you've flown lately. But what I appreciate about it is that it made pilot training a whole lot more realistic. That a lot of the male ego things had to be subdued when suddenly, they had women pilots. And so I think the quality of everything really got better when they integrated women into military pilot training.
It's such an extensive history, Ben, and it leads me to my last question, is that if you were to talk to someone who was looking at the different branches, trying to decide where they wanted to enlist, what would you say to them to say the Air Force is the option I would go with?
Well, I'm up front, I'm biased, but I would say go Air Force. And it's more of the quality of life. I mean, it has to do with mission. It has to be with the concern that people are professionally developed, both as non-commissioned officers or officers, that they truly are skilled and capable, because we'll never have as many people as we want. So you got to be the best you can be, literally, to make the most of what you have. But at the same time, the Air Force takes care of people, and they make it possible for you to do the things they ask you to do. So, the Air Force was always very good to me. I always gave them everything they asked of me, and they gave me everything I needed. So I went into it without the intention to make a career out of it, but it wound up being such a good deal. I said, I think I better stick around to retirement. So that's what I did.
In a couple of weeks, James, I want to hear your rebuttal as to why that person should join the Marines. Becky, would you like to give a rebuttal? I don't know if you'll be joining us for our Army episode, but if you had a rebuttal for the Army.
I don't know. Nate was a recruiter for about 2 years, and he didn't like the job. He said it was too salesy. It was very hard to try to convince young people to choose the Army over other branches of service. So, so it would be interesting if he were here to involve himself in that conversation.
Moving on to our Scuttlebutt round. I'm going to spin the wheel. We always have a digital wheel here, and we spin the wheel, and we don't know where it's going to land because it's in my head. It landed on James. What do you know?
Surprise, surprise. All right. Next year will mark 35 years of one of the greatest and one of the worst aviation movies on the face of the planet, Top Gun and Iron Eagle. Iron Eagle came out in '86. So did Top Gun. They'll both hit 35.
Wow.
And sorry, Ben, but you had the worst movie. Iron Eagle was yours. But the Navy just made sure to, in a recent post, made Tom Cruise and Jerry Bruckheimer honorary Navy aviators ahead of the Top Gun release. So they get to wear the wings of gold.
Wow. And do you get to,
need to do something for Chappie?
Do you break the wings of gold once you get them and you hand one piece to someone else? Is that the tradition?
I have no idea. I'm not that cool enough to have the golden wings. I'm cool enough to watch the movie and can't wait for the next one to come out.
I agree. Ben, was that the tradition, breaking the wing?
Well, oh yeah, when you graduated pilot training, the issue wing they gave as tradition was to break it. That was considered a bad omen not to do the one they issued to you. But you always made sure you wore your wings properly. They get about, people might not have their rank on or the ribbons on right, but they always had their wings on right.
Becky, do you have a bit of scuttlebutt for us?
The one thing that came to my mind is the World War II Germany's bizarre obsession with posing with a polar bear mascot. And that just blew my mind. And I have a friend who's from Germany. She's been in the US for about 30 years. And I texted that information to her, and she said she's never heard of such a thing. So I'd like to dig a little further on that, but I'm not sure about the Germans' World War II obsession with the polar bear mascot.
Definitely read some more
It's
on
not
that.
something I experienced.
No.
Thank you. And Ben, do you have a scuttlebutt for us?
Well, I think it's of interest that yesterday the Space Force did launch their operational part of their command, as far as how they're going to operate, satellites and the space-based radars and all the things in doing that. So they're getting their act together very, very rapidly in their new operating environment. And of course, there's lots of emphasis on operations, and they've now got the command structure and supervision and everything to make that happen.
I can't wait to talk about them. I think we're going to save them for last in our 6-part series, but I know that their 1-year anniversary is coming up, and there's going to be a lot of announcements that are going to happen. We'd like to air our episode specific to the Space Force after or during that 1-year anniversary so that we can bring you all the new headline updates. My scuttlebutt for today is why no apostrophe in Veterans Day? Well, according to the Department of Veterans Affairs, Veterans Day isn't spelled with an apostrophe before or after the S because it's not a day that belongs to veterans. It's a day to honor them. On November 11th, 1921, the United States, Britain, and France all held ceremonies to bury an unknown soldier in the most hallowed cemeteries in their respective countries. They would call it Armistice Day. The day didn't belong to the men who fought and died in the Great War. It was a day to honor them. The first celebration to use the term Veterans Day came in 1947 when World War II veteran Raymond Weeks organized a movement for a National Veterans Day to honor all Americans who served in the armed forces. It was held on the same day, Armistice Day, November 11th, in 1954, when President Dwight Eisenhower made the switch from Armistice Day to Veterans Day permanent. I didn't know that, so I found a bit interesting article that talked about why there's no apostrophe. But yes.
Yeah, because those Veterans Breakfast Club has no apostrophe either.
Mm-hmm.
And that was Todd's wife that corrected Todd on that one.
This has been the Scuttlebutt episode. We thank you so much for tuning in and either listening or watching. We hope that you will like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell for us. Engage with us on YouTube or through email. You can find us every Monday with new interesting military headlines. Our Scuttlebutt, our next main story is going to be focused on the Navy. So we're going to bring in some very interesting Navy veterans. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you so much for joining us.